He thought he was sentencing another reckless black kid until the teenager started tearing apart the case, piece by piece, like a Harvard-trained lawyer. Los Angeles County Courthouse was buzzing that morning. A cold fog still clung to the windows as the security line stretched around the block. Reporters had begun gathering outside hours before the hearing even started. Inside courtroom 2B, the energy was strange. Like everyone could feel something was about to happen, but no one knew what. At the defendant's table stood Malik Thompson, 19 years old, shoulders squared, hoodie zipped up halfway. His expression was calm, almost too calm for someone being charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. He didn't shift nervously. He didn't fidget. His hands stayed in his pockets, his eyes staining the room like he had studied it before, and maybe he had. Across from him sat Ethan Wallace, the assistant district attorney, dressed like every closing argument was a photo op. Navy blue tailored suit, white pocket square, arrogance polished to perfection. His chin was tilted slightly upward, as if Malik's very presence in the room was an insult to the justice system. And on the bench, Judge Ronald Grayson, 62 years old, thick silver hair combed straight back. He didn't look up when Malik entered, just kept reading the file like it was already done. You could practically hear the golf course calling his name. Grayson had seen 1,000 defendants like Malik. Or so he thought. Another black kid from South LA. Hoodie. No expensive lawyer, no connections, probably guilty, probably would plead out. Just get it over with. And to be fair, Malik knew that's what they all thought. But what they didn't know was that Malik had spent more time inside courtrooms than most rookie attorneys. His mother, Angela Thompson, had been a paralegal for over 2 decades. She never sugarcoated anything when she came home. Malik grew up at the dinner table listening to war stories, how prosecutors buried evidence, how judges favored officers, how public defenders barely had time to read the files. He listened. He remembered. By the time Malik turned 15, he could quote landmark cases better than his civics teacher. He watched mock trial competitions on YouTube like other kids watched basketball. When his friends were out partying, Malik was cross-referencing sentencing patterns by judge. The courtroom wasn't foreign to him, it was familiar. It was almost personal. Still, he had never imagined he'd end up here, on the wrong side of the law. But he also knew this wasn't about justice. It was about statistics, appearances, assumptions. They said he'd been caught red-handed, behind the wheel of a stolen 2022 Audi A6. Said he led officers on a brief foot chase, that his fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, that Officer Ruiz had personally witnessed him driving. It sounded like an open and shut case. But Malik knew better. He could feel it in his bones. This was going to be different. He hadn't even planned to represent himself. But when his court-appointed attorney, Rachel Bennett, leaned over and whispered, "I think we should take the deal," something inside Malik shifted. He looked up at the judge and realized no one in that room expected him to fight. And if no one believed in him, he'd do what he always did, go solo. Angela had begged him not to do it. "This ain't a movie, Malik. You're not in some Netflix show. These people don't play fair." But he had looked her in the eye and said, "Ma, if I don't speak for myself, no one else will." And now, here he was, standing alone, every eye on him, every presumption weighing him down. But Malik didn't blink. He wasn't there to play defense. He was there to dismantle everything they thought they knew. Judge Grayson finally looked up from the file. "Mr. Thompson," he said dryly, "do you understand the charges against you?" Malik's voice was calm, steady. "Yes, Your Honor." "And how do you plead?" He glanced at his attorney, then back to the judge. "Not guilty. Also, I'll be representing myself." The room paused, like someone hit mute on a remote. The stenographer stopped typing. A cough echoed. Even Wallace looked up, eyebrows raised. Grayson raised an unimpressed brow. "You'll what?" Malik repeated it. "I'll be defending myself." The judge sighed. "Suit yourself." That was the moment the air shifted. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but Malik wasn't just defending himself. He was about to flip the entire script. and the system wasn't ready for it. The courtroom had barely settled when Assistant District Attorney Ethan Wallace stood. His movements were deliberate, rehearsed, like a man who had done this 1,000 times and already decided how this one would end. "Your Honor," Wallace began, adjusting his tie, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Mr. Malik Thompson, was caught in possession of a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest." He stepped toward the jury box, his voice smooth and confident. Officers pursued the vehicle through downtown Los Angeles, where the defendant attempted to flee on foot. He was apprehended blocks away. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, and Officer Daniel Ruiz, a 10-year veteran of the LAPD, personally witnessed Mr. Thompson behind the wheel during the pursuit. A low murmur passed through the gallery. On the surface, it sounded damning. Wallace delivered it like gospel. Judge Grayson nodded, uninterested. "Sounds straightforward." Wallace turned and returned to his seat, the faintest hint of a smirk curling his lips. Malik remained still, his expression unreadable. He knew Wallace's strategy. It was always the same: state it like fact, act like the jury's already convinced, and don't leave room for doubt. Grayson looked over the rim of his glasses. "Defense?" Malik stepped forward slowly, the sound of his shoes soft against the tile. He let the silence settle just long enough to draw attention. Then he turned to the prosecutor's table. "Mr. Wallace," he said calmly, "you said Officer Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel." Wallace nodded, already bored. "That's correct, it's in the official report." Malik turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I move to have that testimony dismissed as inadmissible." Grayson blinked. "On what grounds?" "Because it's not true," Malik replied. "Officer Ruiz wasn't even at the scene during the initial pursuit. In fact, he wasn't on duty until nearly 30 minutes after the chase began." The courtroom stirred. Wallace narrowed his eyes. "That's absurd." Malik didn't flinch. "If the court allows, I'd like to request the officer's GPS logs for that night. If he was where he claimed to be, the logs will confirm it." Grayson paused, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Prosecution?" Wallace hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. Malik pressed, his voice still calm but deliberate. "If Officer Ruiz's location doesn't match his testimony, then that evidence is false, and any conclusions drawn from it fall apart." Grayson finally spoke. "Does the prosecution object to pulling those logs?" Wallace shifted in his seat. "No objections, Your Honor." But it was too late. The jury noticed the pause. The gallery noticed it. Most importantly, Grayson noticed it. Malik nodded once, then continued. "Let's talk about the fingerprint evidence," he said, turning to face the jury. "The prosecution wants you to believe that because my fingerprints were on the steering wheel, I must have stolen the car. That's the story they're selling." He took a slow step forward. "But imagine you walk into a store and try on a jacket. You touch it, zip it up, maybe even put your hands in the pockets. Then you put it back and leave. Hours later, someone else steals it. Would your fingerprints mean you committed the crime?" He let the question hang in the air. A few jurors glanced at each other. One leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. Malik nodded. "The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven earlier that day. I was with 3 friends. We went in, grabbed some snacks. On the way out, I leaned on the car. The door was unlocked, so yeah, I opened it. Dumb? Sure. Criminal? No." He paused again. "I didn't drive it. I didn't steal anything. I didn't run. I walked home. The car was found abandoned blocks away. I was arrested walking, not driving." Wallace stood quickly. "Objection, this is just the defendant's version of events. There's no corroboration." Malik turned to him. "Then let's bring in the forensic expert. Let's ask them how those prints were analyzed." He turned to Grayson. "Was the fingerprint specialist subpoenaed to testify?" Grayson looked to Wallace, who stiffened. Wallace finally admitted, "No, Your Honor." Malik tilted his head slightly. "So the state is using forensic evidence to convict me, but they didn't bother to bring in the person who handled that evidence? No cross-examination, no questions about chain of custody, no confirmation on how clean the prints were, just, 'Trust us?'" He stepped back for a moment, letting the silence do the work. The jury was listening now, not just hearing, listening. And while we're at it, Malik said, his voice sharpening slightly, let's talk about who actually owns the car. Wallace's head snapped up. Malik pulled a sheet of paper from his folder and held it up. This is a transcript from the original police report, a statement from Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi. He began reading aloud. I left my car running when I ran into the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy they arrested. I saw the kid, he was white. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Wallace's jaw clenched. Grayson sat back, his face unreadable. Malik looked at the jury. That statement was part of the initial report, but the prosecution never mentioned it, never submitted it, never challenged it, because it didn't fit the story they wanted you to believe. Wallace tried to interject. Your Honor, Malik cut him off, calm but direct. Mr. Wallace, is it true that this statement was in the original case file? Wallace didn't answer. Malik turned back to the judge. Your Honor, that omission isn't just oversight, it's manipulation. Grayson let out a long breath, rubbing his temple. The cracks in the case were no longer subtle, and Malik wasn't done. He returned to the jury one final time. I wasn't arrested because I matched the suspect description. I was arrested because I was a black teenager walking home in the same zip code where a crime happened. He looked them dead in the eyes. That's not justice. That's profiling. Then he stepped back. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was deafening. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on Malik. For the first time that morning, the courtroom didn't feel like his. The control was slipping. The boy standing before him wasn't playing defense anymore. He was orchestrating something, and everyone in the room could feel it. Wallace shuffled papers at the prosecution's table, searching for footing, trying to reset the narrative. Your Honor, he said quickly, while the defense attempts to muddy the waters, the fact remains Malik Thompson's fingerprints were inside the stolen car, and he was found in close proximity to where it was abandoned. Malik raised a hand gently, signaling that he wasn't done. Grayson nodded. Go ahead, Mr. Thompson. Malik's voice remained calm, but there was a quiet intensity beneath every word now. Let's stop pretending like proximity equals guilt. I was walking, unarmed, carrying a plastic bag with a bottle of Gatorade and a bag of chips. I wasn't sweating. I wasn't out of breath. I didn't even know the car had been stolen until I was handcuffed on the ground with a knee in my back. He let that image sit for a moment. But if you still think fingerprints are enough to convict me, he said, reaching into his folder again, let's talk about the forensic process. Because I filed a motion 2 weeks ago to review the lab chain of custody documents. They arrived yesterday. He held up a set of papers, and guess what? There were 2 partial prints on the steering wheel. Only one of them matched me. The other was never identified. No attempt was made to compare it to anyone else. No follow-up. No questions asked. Why? Because I was already the target. Whispers spread across the gallery. Jurors leaned forward. Wallace didn't move. Grayson adjusted his glasses, his expression tight. Malik lowered the documents. This wasn't an investigation. It was a shortcut. A rush to close a case, not to find the truth. If they had taken 5 more minutes, if they had done their job, I wouldn't be here right now. Then, as if the courtroom wasn't already shifting beneath their feet, the door at the back of the room creaked open. Heads turned. A woman stepped in, holding a manila folder against her chest. It was Angela Thompson, Malik's mother. She moved with quiet urgency, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She approached the defense table, nodded to the judge respectfully, and leaned in to whisper something in Malik's ear. He turned toward her, took the folder, and opened it slowly. Inside were 2 items, a printed email thread and a copy of the original 911 call transcript. Malik scanned the first few lines, then looked up at the judge. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to submit newly surfaced communication from the original reporting officer. It's an internal email exchange between Officer Ruiz and another officer, dated the night of the incident. Grayson gave a cautious nod. Proceed. Malik cleared his throat. In the email, Officer Ruiz wrote, and I quote, "The kid we brought in doesn't match the guy I saw jump into the Audi, but command said move forward anyway. No need to open another file. case is good enough to close." A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Malik didn't flinch. "Your Honor, this is written proof that they knew I didn't match the suspect and still charged me anyway. They didn't care about truth. They cared about numbers, about clearing the docket, about maintaining the illusion of efficiency." Wallace rose from his seat, voice tight. "Your Honor, I haven't seen that document. I'd like time to authenticate." Grayson raised a hand to silence him. "Sit down, counselor." Wallace's mouth opened, then closed. Malik opened the second document. And just to be thorough, he continued. "Here's a transcript of the original 911 call, placed by Mr. Whitaker, the car's owner. In it, he clearly describes the suspect as white, wearing a red hoodie. I'm black. I was wearing a gray jacket. And yet, somehow, none of this found its way into the prosecution's case file." He turned back to the jury. "This case isn't just flawed, it's rigged. It's the kind of thing that happens when you're poor, when you're young, and when you're black in America. They assumed I'd be scared, that I'd take a deal, that I wouldn't know enough to fight back. But I do, and now, so do you. So do you." Grayson stared down at his bench, fingers pressed tightly together, his knuckles white. You could see it, he was replaying everything. The smugness from earlier was gone. All that remained was the realization that he had nearly sent an innocent kid to prison based on a lie. Angela sat in the gallery now, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes locked on her son. Wallace had no rebuttal. His voice, once sharp and confident, had evaporated. He sat motionless, red creeping into his face. Malik took one final breath and said, "Your Honor, unless the prosecution has further evidence, I move to dismiss all charges." Grayson didn't speak for a long time. He looked at Malik, then at Wallace, then down at the documents. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and firm. "Mr. Thompson," he said slowly, "I want to be very clear. This courtroom doesn't see many defendants like you, and maybe that's part of the problem." He paused. "Case dismissed." A wave of gasps, cheers, and stunned silence washed over the room. Reporters scrambled to jot down the final words. One juror broke into quiet applause before catching herself. Wallace slumped in his chair. Grayson sat back and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. And Malik? Malik didn't move. He just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. Not victorious, not smug, just calm, steady, unshaken. The truth had done the talking, and it had won. Malik didn't rush to leave the courtroom. He stood still for a few seconds longer, as if letting the silence wrap around him one last time. The same room that had greeted him with smirks and side-eyes was now holding its breath. Judge Grayson sat motionless, still gripping his gavel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the moment. Something in his eyes had shifted. Not defeat, not anger, something closer to recognition, and maybe, just maybe, regret. Malik turned, gathered his folder, and stepped down slowly from the defense table. The gallery watched in reverent silence, phones half raised but unmoving. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Even the bailiff, who earlier had chuckled during Wallace's opening, stood with his arms crossed, gaze lowered. Angela stood up as Malik approached the aisle. Her eyes were full, but her expression was unreadable. Not proud, not joyful. Something deeper, something fierce. She waited until he was close enough to hear her whisper, "You scared me half to death." Malik scratched the back of his neck. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She shook her head slowly and pulled him into a tight, silent hug. For a long second, the world around them disappeared. No courtroom, no cameras. Just a mother and her son, still standing. When they finally separated, the spell broke. Reporters swarmed toward the doors, camera lights flickering like strobe pulses. Microphones were shoved forward. "Mr. Thompson, did you expect the case to be dismissed?" "Malik, where did you learn to argue like that? What's next for you?" He didn't answer, just pulled his hoodie over his head, kept walking down the marble steps of the courthouse, and let the noise fall behind him. Because this moment wasn't about the headlines. It wasn't about being clever. It wasn't even about winning. It was about not breaking, It was about standing when the world expected you to fold. Washed across the street, parked in the shade of an old elm tree, a familiar figure leaned against a silver sedan. Judge Grayson. Alone. No robes, no courtroom. Just a man looking at another man. Their eyes met, just for a beat, and in that moment something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not approval, but understanding. A silent acknowledgement that the system had been tested today. And it had blinked first. Malik didn't wave. Grayson didn't nod. It wasn't that kind of moment, but it meant something. It meant everything. Later that evening, Malik sat on the porch of their small apartment, a glass of water in one hand, his folder of court notes in the other. Angela came out, still in her work clothes, her shoes kicked off, and her hair wrapped in a scarf. She didn't say anything right away, just sat beside him, elbows on her knees. "I thought they were going to eat you alive in there," she said quietly. Malik smiled faintly. "They almost did." "You think it's over?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not even close." Angela looked out toward the street. The sounds of traffic, sirens, laughter, they all blended into the hum of city life. "You're going to do this again, aren't you?" He looked over at her. "Yeah, but next time, I'll have a degree and a license." She chuckled softly, then wiped her eyes. "Told you you were too stubborn for your own good." He leaned back in his chair, exhaled, and stared at the stars just starting to peek through the haze. For a moment, he let himself feel it. Relief, exhaustion, clarity. But underneath all that was a fire that hadn't dimmed. If anything, it had grown. Because if it had taken him years of study, weeks of preparation, and a miracle of truth to walk out of that courtroom free, then how many others had been swallowed by it? How many Maliks never got to speak? How many names had disappeared into files, erased by assumptions and unchecked power? He thought about the other defendants he'd seen that day. Wide-eyed, hopeless, too broke for real defense, too tired to fight. They weren't stupid. They were just unarmed. That's what this was really about. Not proving he was smart, not getting applause, but breaking the cycle, cracking the shell of a system that had operated in darkness for too long. He wasn't the exception. He was proof that it could be challenged. And he wasn't done. Angela reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever path you choose, just don't forget who you are." He smiled. "I couldn't even if I tried." Inside, Malik's phone buzzed, notifications piling up. A short video clip of his courtroom takedown had already gone viral. Over 1 million views in 4 hours. Hashtags like Malik Thompson system on trial and truth spoken were trending. The world had watched. And more importantly, the world had listened. But Malik stayed seated, watching the sky fade from gold to navy. Because this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one teenager walking free. It wasn't about legal brilliance or a viral moment. It was about a mirror being held up to a system that too often looks away. Malik didn't win because the truth was obvious. He won because he knew how to fight. He had the knowledge, the courage, the preparation. He had a mother who taught him not to trust the surface of things. He had years of watching, learning, questioning. But ask yourself, what happens to the ones who don't? What happens to the boys who don't know how to speak the language of the court? The girls who don't get access to the transcripts? The families too scared or too broke to push back? How many of them sit in jail cells right now because someone didn't want to take an extra minute to ask the right question? This wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a warning, a wake-up call, a reminder that justice isn't automatic. It's a fight. And if someone like Malik hadn't stood up, if he hadn't challenged every assumption, if he hadn't said, "I'll be defending myself," we'd never know how close the system came to burying him. Think about how many others never get that moment. How many stories never get told? How many lives are redirected because a report was copied and pasted, because a judge had a tea time, because someone said, "Close enough"? This story matters not because it's rare, but because it's not. Because every city, every courtroom, every docket is filled with names that no one will remember. And that's the problem. Malik just happened to be ready. But readiness shouldn't be the price of freedom. The truth shouldn't be something you have to earn. So what do we do with that? We remember, we share, we talk about it, we use it to demand better, from our courts, our cops, our laws, and ourselves. We stop assuming guilt because of skin, we stop rewarding shortcuts, and we start expecting integrity. Every single time. Because justice without accountability isn't justice. And silence, in the face of brokenness, is complicity. Malik walked out of that courthouse with his name intact. But make no mistake, this isn't over. He's not the only one, he won't be the last. The question is, will we keep watching? Will we keep caring? Will we speak up when the next Malik stands alone? If this story made you feel something, if it made you pause or think or even get angry, then don't just scroll past. Share it, talk about it, teach it, let it ripple beyond the screen. Because real change doesn't come from viral videos. It comes from what we do next. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people, and people can change if we make them.